Clara sat at the table of a dimly lit kitchen, staring intently at the coffee cup in her hands. The weak light from the lamp matched the heavy feeling on her shoulders. It was yet another lonely night since Renato had disappeared, and the memory of him grew more bitter each day. They had met when they were young, fell in love quickly, and the dream of building a life together once seemed unbreakable. But what remained now was only a fragmented and hopeless life. Renato had left her with a baby in her arms and an empty promise. "I'm going to buy cigarettes," he'd said one afternoon and never returned. Clara waited for days, convincing herself he would appear, that his absence was temporary. But as the weeks passed, reality settled in. He wasn't coming back. And while grappling with this truth, she felt that everything left of their marriage was there, in her lap, crying and demanding more than she could give. As the months went by, the baby became an increasing burden for Clara. The endless crying irritated her, and each moment with the child brought forth the anger and resentment she harbored toward Renato. "Why did he leave and burden me with this?" she thought as frustration rooted itself in her heart. That life she had once envisioned with Renato had turned into something heavy and dark. All she wanted was to be free of this past. It was on one of those nights, tired from work, mentally exhausted, and feeling she couldn't bear it any longer, that the thought came to her. She looked at the baby in her arms, and a decision began to take shape in her mind. She would leave him behind. She no longer wanted to deal with the responsibilities, the crying, the weight of Renato's abandonment. And so, in a desperate act, Clara put on her coat, wrapped the baby in a blanket, and left the house. The streets were deserted, and the biting cold made her hands tremble as she walked toward the subway station. In her mind, she justified the decision. He will have a chance to be found by someone who truly wants to take care of him, someone who doesn't see him as a burden. When she reached a trash bin near the subway, she looked around to ensure she was alone. The empty station amplified the feeling of loneliness, but Clara ignored any doubt and placed the baby there, inside the bin. For a moment, she hesitated, but soon a sense of relief washed over her. She turned, not looking back, disappearing into the darkness of the night, believing that decision would finally lift the weight she carried in her heart. Hours later, dawn crept in silently. Mary, a dedicated nurse known for her kindness, was leaving the hospital after another exhausting shift. The heavy routine was part of her life, but that night, she felt especially tired. Hurrying to catch her bus, Mary heard a sound that made her stop abruptly. It was a faint, fragile cry, blending with the distant noise of the trains. Her heart raced. Something was terribly wrong with that sound. She followed the noise, guided by the maternal instinct she had always carried, until she found an old, dirty trash bin positioned beside a worn-out bench. When she lifted the lid, her eyes widened at the sight. A baby, with a red face and tear-filled eyes, was crying desperately, wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket. Mary could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her heart clenched, and a wave of compassion washed over her. Without hesitation, she reached out and picked up the baby, feeling the cold, trembling little body against her chest. She wrapped him in her coat, holding him close to warm him. A mixture of anger and sadness filled her as she imagined how someone could abandon such a helpless child. As the baby calmed down in her arms, Mary gently stroked his soft hair, feeling an inexplicable bond with him. She knew she couldn't leave him there. She knew her life would change from that moment on. She decided to take the baby home, no matter the consequences. Something inside her told her that this encounter was more than a coincidence. It was a calling. On the way to her apartment, Mary spoke softly to the baby, trying to soothe him with her gentle voice. In her heart, she was already thinking about the future, about how she would protect this child, even without knowing the details of how it all happened. Once home, she set up an improvised bed and watched over him as he slept, determined to give him a chance to be loved and live a dignified life. That night, she didn't sleep. She stayed by his side, watching him, knowing that a new journey was beginning. In the following weeks, Mary quickly adapted to her new role as a mother. She named the baby Lucas, a name she had always liked because it meant Light. Indeed, he brought a renewed light into her life. The hospital work was exhausting, but the joy of returning home to Lucas transformed any fatigue into an invigorating energy. Looking at Lucas's small face, Mary forgot the world outside, finding a peace in him she hadn't felt in a long time. Every day, Mary discovered little things about Lucas. He loved hearing stories before bed, even though he was still too young to understand the words. And she read to him every night, like a sacred ritual. Lucas also seemed to adore the sound of her voice, smiling and babbling as she spoke. Mary spent hours watching his first smiles, his clumsy movements, his tiny hands that gripped her with surprising strength. As Lucas grew, Mary's simple apartment transformed into a warm and lively home. She decorated the walls with colorful drawings he made at school, and the toys scattered on the floor, which once looked like a mess, were now part of her daily happiness. Even on a tight budget, Mary spared no effort to ensure Lucas had a joyful childhood. He became the center of her life, and she did everything with love and dedication. However, Mary never told Lucas about the circumstances in which she found him. He believed he was her son, and she raised him with that conviction, although she secretly hoped he would never learn the truth. Each birthday, Mary celebrated with a small party, cooking his favorite dish and showering him with gifts that, though simple, were always chosen with love. Lucas grew up feeling loved, safe, and protected. The years passed quickly, and to Mary, it felt like she blinked and her little Lucas was already a teenager, soon to turn 18. He grew up to be a kind and joyful young man, reflecting the love and dedication with which Mary had raised him. Lucas was also a talented boy, always excelling in his studies and community projects. Mary felt proud of him every day, proud to have been his mother, even if biology wasn't the bond between them. One Sunday morning, during breakfast, Lucas mentioned that he had entered a lottery. It was one of those popular contests with $1 million prize for the right combination of numbers. Mary laughed, amused by his excitement. "It doesn't hurt to try, does it?" he said, smiling. To him, it was just a game, an opportunity to dream of the impossible. Weeks later, as Mary finished her shift at the hospital, she received an urgent call from Lucas. He was ecstatic, his voice trembling with emotion. "Mom, I won. I won the lottery," he shouted, with a joy Mary hadn't heard since his childhood. At first, she thought he was joking, but as she heard the genuine excitement in his voice, she realized it was true. The news spread quickly. Within days, Lucas was in the local newspapers and even on some TV shows. A young man from humble beginnings who had won a massive fortune. The story inspired and moved people. But with the fame came attention from people with questionable motives. Mary grew worried, aware that money brought not only opportunities but also risks. Then one night, while watching the news, Clara saw Lucas's face on the television. She froze, immediately recognizing him as the son she had abandoned so many years ago. Shock was quickly followed by a wave of regret and ambition. Without hesitation, Clara called Renato, her ex-husband and Lucas's biological father, and told him about her discovery. "You need to see this," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "Our son. He's a millionaire. We have to do something." Clara hung up the phone and sat in silence, trying to process the enormity of what she had just discovered. Memories from years ago surged back with force. The abandonment of Lucas, the frustration she had felt. It all seemed like a distant story, now overshadowed by a growing desire to seize this newfound opportunity. She looked in the mirror and saw an expression she hadn't seen in a long time. A mix of regret, but also ambition. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept imagining what her life could be like if she could reconnect with Lucas and somehow convince everyone, including him, that she was his mother. The next day, she met with Renato at a discreet cafe downtown. He looked tired. Life hadn't been kind to him either. Despite everything, when Clara mentioned Lucas's fortune, a spark of interest lit up in his eyes. "We have the right to reconnect with him," Clara said, a tone of certainty and nervousness in her voice. Renato agreed with a smile that revealed more greed than remorse. Clara and Renato spent hours discussing strategies. They both knew that Lucas had been raised by another woman, but they also knew they were his biological parents, which, at least in the eyes of the law, gave them undeniable rights. They decided the best way to approach him was through legal action, claiming that they had lost their son unjustly. They would argue that Mary had kidnapped Lucas years ago and that they were only trying to correct a wrong. Clara and Renato hired a lawyer who, whether out of coincidence or greed, saw potential in the story and took on the case, excited by the prospect of media attention and fame. The preparations for the lawsuit began. Clara and Renato's lawyers gathered arguments, building a narrative that painted Mary as a ruthless woman who had taken advantage of the opportunity to steal Lucas when he was just a baby. It was a sensational story, but for the public and the courts it might work. As the scheme unfolded, Mary and Lucas remained unaware of the storm about to hit their lives. A week later, Lucas found an unusual envelope among the Daily Mail. There was no return address, only his name and address written by hand. Curious, he opened it and found an anonymous letter that contained disturbing details about his past. The lines revealed, in a direct and cold manner, that Mary was not his biological mother and that he had been abandoned as a baby. The letter mentioned his abandonment and claimed his biological parents were ready to reclaim their rights. Lucas was paralyzed. The words of the letter spun in his mind, and he couldn't understand why someone would send such shocking information anonymously. He felt a mix of shock, confusion, and sadness. It was hard to accept that everything he believed about himself could be a lie. After hours of reflection, he decided to confront Mary. He needed to hear the truth from her. Mary, who was preparing dinner when Lucas entered the kitchen, immediately noticed the seriousness on his face. Without delay, he showed her the letter and demanded answers. Mary was silent for a moment, absorbing the situation and feeling a tightness in her chest. She had always known that, one day, Lucas would need to know the truth, but she never imagined it would happen this way, so abruptly and painfully. With a deep sigh, Mary began to recount the story of how she had found him, alone and abandoned, on a cold night at the subway station. She explained how she was guided by the instinct to protect him and how she decided to care for him, despite all the hardships. Her voice was soft, filled with emotion, and Lucas could see the tears in her eyes as she narrated every detail. She didn't hide the truth. He wasn't her biological son, but from the moment she held him in her arms, she had never seen him any other way. Lucas listened in silence, processing every word. He saw the sincerity and love in Mary's eyes, and even with the revelation of his origin, one thing was certain. She was his mother, the woman who had given him a life, who had raised and loved him like no one else. He felt a mix of relief and gratitude, though uncertainty about the future still loomed. After their conversation, Lucas spent hours reflecting. He thought about the meaning of family and how, regardless of blood ties, Mary had been the one by his side at every moment. However, what troubled him most was the purpose behind the letter and what his biological parents really intended. He knew something more was at stake, and the peace he had always felt with Mary was about to be threatened. In the days following the revelation, Lucas and Mary lived with a constant sense of tension, as if a storm was about to break. Mary felt the weight of the situation and feared that the past was returning to tear apart everything she had lovingly built. Lucas, despite Mary's support, was haunted by the idea of meeting his biological parents. Even after all that Mary had told him, he felt the need to understand the intentions of the parents who had abandoned him. Then one morning, Mary received a court notice delivered to her door. The document, cold and formal, stated that Clara and Renato were seeking custody of Lucas, claiming he had been taken from them unjustly. The accusations were baseless and entirely false, but the mere prospect of facing a lawsuit shook Mary deeply. She knew the system could be ruthless, and she feared that, with the support of competent lawyers and the tragic story Clara and Renato had crafted, the court's decision might not be in her favor. Lucas was equally shaken by the news of the lawsuit. The confusion in his mind was overwhelming. How could someone who abandoned him now want to recover him? But the most painful part was seeing the suffering this situation was causing Mary, who had always been there for him. Determined to support her, Lucas told Mary he was ready to face this battle with her, because he didn't want her to be punished unjustly for the love she had always shown him. In the days leading up to the start of the trial, Mary gathered the strength to share her full story. Close friends and neighbors, who knew the care she had devoted to Lucas, offered to testify on her behalf. Everyone knew that Clara and Renato's claims were a complete distortion of the facts. But despite the support, fear still loomed over Mary, and she knew she needed to be strong for Lucas, even if her heart was breaking. At the first hearing, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, and people who sympathized with Mary and Lucas filled the room, all interested in the story. Clara and Renato, on the other hand, arrived hand in hand, looking determined and feigning emotional distress. They used every trick to present themselves as wronged and repentant parents, feeding into the narrative they had created. Mary, however, remained composed, despite her nervousness. She testified sincerely, recounting in detail how she found Lucas and decided to raise him with love and dedication, never asking for anything in return. Her voice was clear and steady, and those present could feel the truth in every word. The courtroom became a stage of tension, where truth and lies clashed, and everyone awaited Lucas's response about who he considered, in fact, his true family. When it was Lucas's turn to testify, a silence fell over the courtroom. He looked at Clara and Renato, the faces of people who, until recently, had only been shadows in his imagination. He tried to imagine what could have driven them to abandon him, but instead of answers, he found only emptiness. He knew he had to express what he truly felt, but he also knew his words could have a definitive impact on the judge's decision. With a deep breath, Lucas began his testimony. He told the judge and those present how Mary had always been his mother in every way. He explained how she raised him, provided him with an education, security, and, above all, unconditional love. "She gave me everything I have, everything I am," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "I can't imagine my life without her. I love her as my mother, and I will always love her that way." Lucas looked at Clara and Renato, with a mix of curiosity and sadness. "I understand that you are my biological parents," he said carefully, "but the truth is that I don't remember you, and I don't remember ever receiving anything from you. To me, Mary will always be my true mother. She's been there for me, supported me, and taught me everything I know about kindness and integrity." Hearing Lucas's words, Clara tried to contain her frustration, but her eyes revealed a mixture of anger and despair. Renato, on the other hand, stared at the floor, avoiding Lucas's gaze. Both seemed to realize, in that moment, that a blood connection wasn't enough to guarantee the affection of a son they had rejected. Lucas's declaration moved the courtroom. People seated nearby watched him with empathy and respect. The judge listened intently and took notes, recording Lucas's words carefully. The impact of his testimony was clear. He didn't want to be separated from Mary, and his words left Clara and Renato's case even weaker. At the end of his testimony, Lucas returned to sit beside Mary, who embraced him tightly. She felt immense gratitude for him sharing his truth, but, above all, she felt relief. Regardless of what came next, she knew that Lucas considered her his mother, and that was what mattered most. After Lucas's testimony, the courtroom fell silent. His words echoed in everyone's minds, and even the judge seemed moved by the young man's honest and emotional account. The trial continued with Clara and Renato's lawyers trying to salvage the narrative they had built. They argued that, despite everything, Clara and Renato were the biological parents and had the legal right to reconnect with Lucas, emphasizing that he belonged to them by blood. However, the sincerity of Lucas and the strong presence of Mary had deeply touched those present. Days later, the final moment arrived. The judge was ready to deliver the verdict. Clara and Renato were tense, trying to maintain composure, while Mary and Lucas sat together, hands clasped. In a grave and serious tone, the judge declared that, based on the testimonies and the evidence presented, it was clear that Mary was the person who best met Lucas's needs and well-being. "Blood ties are important," he said, pausing thoughtfully, "but sincere love and care are the true foundations of family. With the decision in Mary's favor, murmurs filled the courtroom. Lucas took a deep breath, feeling a relief he had never experienced before. He embraced Mary tightly, both in tears, as the weight of the previous weeks seemed to dissolve into the air. Mary held him as if for the first time, recalling the baby she had found at the subway station so many years ago. Clara and Renato, however, were inconsolable. Clara's anger and resentment were visible, while Renato, sensing the failure of their plan, just stared at the floor, defeated. As they left the courtroom, Clara made one last attempt to approach Lucas, but he gently pulled away. "You made your choices many years ago," he said with a calm, mature determination. "I've made mine as well. Mary is my mother, and nothing will change that." With those words, he said goodbye to his biological parents, closing a chapter of his life that had never had the chance to begin. They walked away, humiliated and without the money they had so coveted. This was their final attempt to gain something from Lucas, but now they were officially out of his life. The victory in court represented not only the triumph of justice but also the strengthening of the bond between Lucas and Mary. The days following the trial were filled with peace and reflection for Mary and Lucas. Mary felt that the ordeal had strengthened her relationship with Lucas even further, as if each hardship had only reinforced the love they shared. One quiet evening, as they talked in the living room, Lucas expressed his gratitude for everything she had done for him. "I'll never be able to repay all you've given me, Mom," he said, eyes brimming with tears. Mary smiled and replied that his love and presence were the only reward she needed. Determined to honor all that Mary had done for him, Lucas began planning how he could use part of his prize money to give her a more comfortable life. With the money, he helped Mary renovate the apartment, giving her the home she had always dreamed of. He also established a charity fund in her name, dedicated to helping abandoned children, as he once had been. Mary was moved by his initiative, recognizing Lucas's generous heart and his constant desire to do good. For Lucas, the charity fund was a way to turn his own experiences into something positive for others. Money was no longer about luxury or showing off. It was a means to give back to the world and to honor Mary's love, which had taught him to see life with kindness and generosity. Thanks to her, he knew he would never be consumed by ambition or greed, traits he had witnessed in his biological parents. The story of Lucas and Mary became known in the community, inspiring others to value bonds of affection and generosity. Their lives took on new meaning, now free from the shadows of the past and focused on a hopeful future. Together, they dedicated themselves to creating a warmer world for those in need, finding purpose in helping others. As they walked through the neighborhood one afternoon, Mary realized that despite the hardships, she had found in Lucas a new chance at happiness. He was the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return, and that was all that mattered. With a tight embrace, mother and son moved forward, knowing that together, they could face any challenge ahead.